Hey guys, what's up? It's Charlie here, and today we're going to be looking at 10 real cases of vampires. So, we're used to seeing vampires in movies and in pop culture, but where did the idea of vampires actually come from? Well, believe it or not, there are some true stories throughout history of real-life vampires. You may recognize some of these true cases as they have been based on things in pop culture, but these are all from real historical journals and diaries from the time. Before we get into it, why not subscribe and press the notification bell too? Coming in at number 10 is MYSLATA of BLAU. When we think of a vampire, we think of a man with perfect hair in a suit. But according to one 14th century journal found in the Czech Republic, this is not the case. One day a journal from the 14th century was found in a small village in what is now the Czech Republic. In the journal it details the life of a man named MYSLATA. MYSLATA was a very poor and humble shepherd. However, one day he passed away, but it didn't take long before he began to reappear to the villagers at night. Many people in the village of BLAU reported seeing MYSLATA after he passed away, and whoever saw him were doomed to pass away themselves 8 days later. They thought perhaps he might still be alive and simply resting in a tomb. So what they did was dug up his remains and drove a stake through his heart. They then put him back in the grave, but days later they realized that did nothing. People kept seeing MYSLATA and passing away, so instead they dug him up again and drove stakes all over his body. This apparently made him roar in pain before he did finally pass away for good. Next up is JOHANNES CUNIUS. So this one comes from the year 1582 in the Czech Republic. Johannes CUNIUS was a civil official living in Pensk. One day he passed away after a horse kicked him in the head in a bad accident. After he was kicked in the head, he was rushed to a hospital. After he passed away, a black cat was seen jumping up onto his hospital bed. In the 16th century in the Czech Republic, this was considered to be a terrible omen. Black cats are a sign of bad luck and also evil. So yeah, not exactly the kind of thing you'd want cropping around right after you passed away. After his passing, villagers of his town began seeing him wandering around at night. Now, he wasn't causing anyone to pass away or anything. Instead, he was scaring children, and also apparently giving off a disgusting aroma. So the town decided to put a stop to this very stinky vampire. They dug him up and chopped his head off. They then set his head on fire and ground it to ash. And then, as an extra precaution, they did the same thing to the rest of his body. They then left his grave empty, and apparently this stopped Johannes from ever turning up to stink up the town again. Make sure you guys wear deodorant after you pass away, otherwise you may find yourself being dug up and set on fire. Next up is the ALNWICK Castle Vampire. So if there's one place to find a vampire, it would be in a castle, right? Well, the ALNWICK Castle has stood in Northumberland, England since 1096. But during the 12th century, there began to be rumours of a vampire in the castle. It was apparently a man from Yorkshire who'd been buried in the cemetery next to the castle. This wasn't known until very recently, when a historian named William de Newburgh discovered records of this case. He found various diaries and journals detailing this castle vampire. Apparently the vampire was also hunchbacked, and he did fiendish deeds at night. He would do bizarre, scary things in the street which really upset and scared all of the local villagers. But one night the terrified villagers took matters into their own hands. They went to the cemetery and dug up the Yorkshire man. Then, with the same spades they used to dig him up with, hacked him to pieces. Apparently as they did this, he made noises, which they took as proof of him being a vampire. So they took the rest of him and then set it on fire. That may seem a little bit extreme, but remember, this guy was really upsetting the locals. I guess the moral to this story is don't mess with people from Northumberland. Next up is New England vampire epidemic. So this is actually a pretty recent discovery of vampires, and it takes place in New England, USA. In 1990, an archaeologist named Nick Bellatoni was excavating some colonial era graves. He was doing this in Griswold, Connecticut. At first, every grave he excavated seemed very normal, but eventually Nick got around to one very strange plot. When he dug it up, the skeleton had no head, and its thigh bones were deliberately crossed. It was as if someone had dug up the grave, removed the head, and then crossed the thigh bones. Well, he soon realized that's exactly what had happened. After digging some more, he found various other grave plots where the bones had been placed in this way. After searching around for miles and miles, he realized this was an epidemic all around New England in the mid-19th century. The bones in this way belonged to people who were suspected vampires. And apparently the only way to stop vampires back then was to remove the head and then cross the thigh bones. Nick says he'd be interested to see what happened to the heads. But if the other stories on this list are anything to go by, it seems like it was likely burnt. Next up is Arnold Powell. This one took place in 1725 in Serbia. A man named Arnold had claimed he was bitten by a Turkish vampire. Apparently he was having some very bad effects because of this vampire bite. And he claimed that if he ate handfuls of dirt from the vampire's grave, he'd be able to cure himself. However, that clearly did not work, or maybe it even worsened it, as 3 days later Arnold passed away. Days later, 4 people came forward claiming Arnold bit them. They were all friends of Arnold and claimed they'd gone to visit his grave. But then when they went there, he emerged and bit them. Those 4 people also passed away shortly after. The townspeople were now very scared, so they dug up Arnold's body to take a look. When they did, they found his eyes wide open, and apparently he was also making very strange noises. So they decided to remove his head and then set him on fire to make sure he couldn't bite anyone ever again. This must have worked, as in the found Serbian journal, there's no more written about Arnold after this. Next up is SAVANOIC. So this is yet another vampire in Serbia. This mysterious vampire is said to be an old man. He was said to lurk around by a watermill on the banks of the river Dragatica. This was located in the village of Zeroš in Serbia. Whenever people came to use the watermill, he would bite them and then take their life. Now, of course, the villagers were terrified to use the mill, and this even resulted in some people passing away due to dehydration. Eventually, the villagers decided to try and stop this vampire, but unlike in the other stories, the villagers were not able to do this. Instead, after too many people who tried to stop him were bitten, they just closed the mill. The mill was then left as an abandoned relic. In 2012, the town considered reopening the mill as a tourist attraction. But right after they did this, the mill collapsed into a sinkhole. Some said this was just a crazy coincidence, while others said this was SAVA the vampire having his last laugh. Next up is Countess Elizabeth Bathory. It's not just poor and humble people who can become vampires. In Transylvania in 1560, Elizabeth Bathory, a noblewoman, turned into a vampire. Prior to this, Elizabeth had it all. Not only was she a noblewoman, she had tons of money. At 12 years old, she married Frederick Nadassi, a well-to-do gentleman. Eventually, Elizabeth's husband passed away, but it seems that turned Elizabeth slightly crazy. She was so terrified of herself aging, so she decided to lure many young women into her castle. She would then take their lives and bathe in their blood. She believed this would keep her looking young and beautiful forever, but when the authorities found out, she was made a prisoner. She was never tried for her crimes as she was too noble and rich, but she was told she was never allowed to leave her castle, and in 1614 she passed away herself. She may not be a supernatural vampire like some of the others on this list, but that is still pretty insane. Next up is PETAR BLAGOJEVICH. So here's another vampire story set in Serbia. In 1725, a man named PETAR passed away. PETAR was very well liked in his village, but after he passed away, he was not whatsoever. That is because one night, PETAR crawled out from his grave and asked his son for food. His son was terrified, so he denied PETAR any food, and for this, PETAR bit him and took his life. The villagers were very panicked, so they waited for him to come out from the grave once again. Eventually, when PETAR left his grave once again, the villagers all grabbed him. They then drove a stake through his heart and put him back in his grave. And according to real diary reports from the time, PETAR never returned. Next up is the Blandford Forum vampire. So Blandford is located in Dorset, England. Today it's a very sleepy town, but in 1762 it was not whatsoever. One day a servant named William Doggett ran off with his master's fortune, but he then felt so guilty he took his own life 1 year later. But it didn't take long before villagers reported seeing William driving around the streets in a ghostly carriage. Then he apparently began biting locals too, so they dug up his grave and they were stunned. William wasn't even in his grave. After this, he wasn't seen again in a ghostly form and didn't bite anyone else. But the mystery of the Blandford Forum vampire was never solved. Check out the poll in the top right corner to vote for the scariest vampire story on this list. If you guys want more amazing videos, check out my second channel. There'll be a link to that on screen in a moment. But as always, thanks for watching. Check out some more videos on screen right now. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to Top 10s.